In this unit, we're going to take a look at garden amendments for sustainability and preparedness. But in particular, we're going to focus on what do you do about garden amendments when you either can't afford to buy them or you're in a situation like the Great Depression, or more specifically, during that little time of trouble when you can't buy or sell if you don't take the mark of the beast. So we're going to take a look at garden amendments, but specifically, what do you do when you can't run to Home Depot and buy that bag of amendments? How do you continue to maintain a garden during these more difficult times?
Our next expert is another master gardener who has additional recommendations about gardening amendments.
Garden fertility strategies on a budget. One of the first things that you can use that is generally free for the using is grass clippings. You can use them as a compost starter. You can see over in the wire bins there as a compost additive. Also in the garden as a mulch to keep weeds down. It will then be utilized as nourishment for the soil, building organic matter within the soil of your garden. You can see over on the far right that there's complete grass clippings around the transplants that are maintaining a weed barrier. Just be sure that the grass clippings are herbicide free and free of weed killers of any sort and lawn fertilizers. It turns out that these work even better as far as weed suppression and being incorporated into the soil as compared to wood chips, in that they are, over the course of a season, completely integrated into the soil and build the soil versus remaining as an inert part of the soil like a wood chip would. You can also use alfalfa meal or clippings as far as a nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus analysis. It's very good. Has very nitrogen rich. Also contains trace minerals that it brings up from the soil. And they are nitrogen fixers, so they have nitrogen in them inherently. Also great to add to a compost pile, and you want to make sure that you're using organic alfalfa meal that's been certified organic, because it's one of the top 3 GMO crops actually in the world, unfortunately. So you do need to make sure that it's organic in nature. A alfalfa compost tea is a great way to side dress your plantings, and the recipe is 1 cup alfalfa meal to 5 gallons of water. Let it brew about 4 days, and then strain the particulates out and water your plantings at the root zone. So alfalfa meal is a very, very good resource for fertilizing, and is generally inexpensive. Also, you can use cover cropping. It's ideal to keep the ground covered. Otherwise, weeds will come in and cover it. Just nature's way of keeping the ground intact. So using a mulch or using other types of chipping debris, but also you can grow cover crops. So things like peas, beans, clover, alfalfa, those are all nitrogen fixers. So while they cover the crop, they also enrich the crop. So peas and beans have the benefit of being able to eat them as food, as well as using their organic matter as soil enrichment. Clover, you can use the red clover tops, which is in the picture here. Ellen White suggested that it would be good to consume red clover tea on a daily basis, and that's the flowers that are particularly utilized in that. Alfalfa, of course, you can mow it and mulch it or plow it and till it. Lots of different ways to use alfalfa, in addition to having nitrogen enrichment in the soil. Stinging nettle. Stinging nettle is a great resource. I was pretty excited when we moved into our place and had stinging nettle available. You can add it to compost, make a compost tea from it by soaking it in water. Then you want to dilute that tea on a 1:20 ratio, 20 parts water. Otherwise it can be too strong. So most compost teas of any sort you want to dilute in some fashion from their straight mixture. They also have great medicinal benefits and important, helpful in wound healing, diarrhea, joint pain, even flu symptom abatement. Just a generally good herb to have around. You can just take those leaves, dry them, and use them either fresh or dried for herbal teas. So the benefits include array of minerals and vitamins, as well as potassium and nitrogen that are inherently a part of the plant, and they tend to grow well when they're established and are often in damp areas, but a great resource to have for the garden, even though you may not want them in the garden growing. A general compost tea, whenever you're keeping a compost bin, if you have a way to retain the drippings, you see the bucket full of drippings there, keep that. Sometimes it's aerated is beneficial to keep air bubbling through it, but again, you'd want to dilute that before putting it straight on your plants, about a 1:20 ratio again for diluting compost tea. You can see they have a spigot over the bucket there. These are various ways to capture the drippings from compost as it's composting. Worm castings. So earthworms are just good soil digesters and conditioners. Red worms, you can see there's all kinds of different aspects. They're safe, they increase fertility of the soil, they increase the yield of the plant. You can see that with and without worm power, supposedly down here in the bottom left picture. They're odorless, non-toxic. They don't burn the plants. They're not overly rich in any one particular mineral. They're environmentally safe. They increase the aeration of the soil, worms do in general, and help to maintain moisture content in the soil and around the plantings where they're used. So worm castings can be very beneficial. You use worm bins to create those worm castings, which can be sometimes a little bit of a struggle to get them going right, get the right ratios, but definitely worth their weight in castings. Here's an example of a worm bin that's been made catching the worm tea. So you can actually use the worm tea, the compost tea, in addition to the castings that are then left over after having had them work through. So they have a variety of news clippings, a little bit of moisture, and a variety of different soil components or food scrap leftovers that are then worked through by the worms and can be utilized for fertilizer in the soil. So nothing should be really thrown away with respect to the components from the garden or your table, as long as they're vegetable matter. You don't want any animal matter of any sort in your worm bins or your compost bin. It should be completely vegetable matter with a kind of a ratio of various organic matters and dry and leaf debris. Newspaper can be used and creates a great tea and worm castings. So you can also just use your weeds that you have. So the bottom picture shows a bathtub full of weeds soaking. Just take those weeds, toss them in a soaking vat, soak them, and you can, based on the nutrition needs of your plants, after you've soaked them, and have the tea, extract the water portion of it, dilute 1 to 10 to 40 parts water. Sometimes an aeration pump is used to kind of keep air moving through. And sometimes the bucket example there shows just putting it in a nylon sack to keep the particulate matter separate from the water matter, and that helps to make it less challenging to actually put it into like a watering can. Otherwise, you may clog up your watering orifices that come out the tip. But weed tea extracts the minerals that you would otherwise be composting or throwing away. If as you weed, you can put them right back on the plants. Comfrey is a great compost and soil builder. It actually draws and mines minerals and other qualities of the soil just straight out of the deep area of the soil. You can see in the buckets there, they've chopped them up and used them as like a green manure, flowers. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, potash, calcium, those are all components that comfrey has to offer when used as a soil amendment. It also has medicinal and herbal qualities associated with it. So you can use it to activate compost as a green manure, i.e. just till it into the soil. Powdered, you can use it as soil amendment or medicinally as well, particularly for joints and wound healing, bones. As a mulch, you can do a garden tea out of it. A seedling booster, put a leaf underneath a seedling, fresh seedling as you're planting it, and it'll help boost it. and as a general soil conditioner. So comfrey is a great go-to plant. There are varieties that produce seeds copiously that it can spread quite significantly, but there's also non-spreading varieties as well, depending on how much you want to have comfrey present on your property. So looking at manure in general, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium breakdown is shown here for several different types. Alpaca manure is at the top of the list with probably the best ratios. Poultry manures are good. Cattle manure is okay. Goat manure. Rabbit manure is really high in nitrogen, so that's like gold if you're looking for nitrogen. I probably wouldn't use pig manure, but other types of manures are more readily available. We use horse manure. Most manures, you want to make sure that you age it for at least a year in your pile. Alpaca manure is one that can be used right away. It's not as hot, so to speak. It won't burn your plants or over-fertilize them too rapidly. You just want to make sure that there have been absolutely no chemicals in it from herbicides or dewormers, etc., that the animals would have gotten from their forage, which then goes through their system and winds up in their manure. I was talking to a neighbor friend that any manure is considered, quotes, organic if it comes out of an animal, regardless of whether herbicide went into the animal. If it comes out, it's supposedly organic. However, we know that it can have effects even going through an animal's digestive tract and affect the plants. There was a man who got a big load of manure and spread it on his garden, and that year when his plants came up, they started twisting and growing thick and deformed, and he just couldn't figure out what it was, and finally tied it to his compost and went and talked to the person he bought the compost from, discovered that they used a new herbicide on their field that year that wasn't supposed to be harmful to the animals, made great fodder without the weeds, but what ended up was it passed through the digestive tract of the animal and was present in the manure and affected the plants of the person who was using the manure as a garden amendment. So you really need to pay close attention to where the animals source their food to make sure that their poo, their manure, is actually beneficial for you as well. So there are some low-cost, no-cost types of soil amendments that can help aid in your soil fertility, and I hope that's been helpful.
I appreciate Andrew Rice's expertise in this area. Another expert that we're going to learn from is Dr. Lloyd Amy. He is a retired Pacific Union College professor of biology, and in his retirement years, he was active in the Master Gardeners group locally. Now, he grew up during the Depression as a kid, and because his family was relatively poor, their family was unable to purchase fertilizers and amendments. So we're going to learn how they got around that experience. You will recall in the last session I showed you a page out of his book, The Country Way, and how this is a drawing of their 2-acre homestead when he was a kid, and how it fed a family of 4, and you'll notice on the right-hand side that they would have vegetables and then a cover crop, corn and then a cover crop, potatoes and a cover crop. In the Bible, there is admonition by the Lord to let the land rest. And in this case, this approach allowed the alternate section of the garden to rest and with a cover crop. And the goal is twofold as I see it. One is to let the land rest. Don't till it up. Don't worry about productivity. Don't worry about the weeds. Just let it rest. And the other advantage is that it can be used to, depending on the cover crop, it can add nitrogen back to the soil. So in this particular case, during these hard times, what his family did is instead of just leaving the ground to just rest and grow into weeds, they would plant either a cover crop of peas or beans, and then they would just let it rest. And the advantage of peas and beans is it adds nitrogen back into the soil, which is part of the idea of letting the land rest with a cover crop. So cover crops depend on what kind of garden, but in general, if you are doing vegetables like they did in that case, you would want to have set aside an area of equal size that would be in a cover crop and letting the land rest. Now, in the case of Lloyd Amy, when he was a child, his family did have chickens and they had a cow. And so both chickens and cows are a very good source of manure. And so that is something to consider. If you were not going to have chickens, for instance, even if you were vegan, you might choose to have chickens strictly for the fertilizer and then feed them food scraps, which they would then efficiently turn into fertilizer. But if you didn't have chickens and didn't have a cow, um, then you wouldn't have a source of manure. It's possible you might have a horse during a time when you can't buy or sell, because then you could have it to, ride to town or to pull an implement. But let's assume you don't have any animals at all. In that case, you would have to up your game in terms of the amount of amendments that you would make to make up for the fact that you can't buy. And so in this case, they did have a horse, and they would have manure on a sled that they'd pull to the garden. But if you were going to not have animals, then you'd have to own a shovel. So what goes into these amendments? Well, you want to compost everything. He said they didn't throw anything away. They composted anything from the food scraps. Uh, if they had bad food in the cellar, instead of dumping it, they would put it into the compost pile. And he said you could even recycle in the kitchen in a flower pot in the window or a bucket for scraps. So you need somewhere to collect these kitchen scraps and not throw them away. And if you had chickens, those scraps could go into the chicken pen, and the chickens would then turn it into really good manure. Or you can decompose the food scraps and make it into compost. Now, he did caution that you need to spread out this compost, especially chickens manure or cow manures for that matter, not too thick, because they're both really strong. And you can see from this picture that decomposition is turning into steam. So Lloyd suggested, for more information, he has quite a bit in his book about that process with chicken and cow manure. The cover crops can not only be peas and beans, but any kind of a legume. He said that alder trees have nodules, on the roots that can be as big as your fist, and they have bacteria that can take nitrogen from the air. That's how they're created, and they can work it into the ground. So if you were having tough times and you had alder trees, you could dig down to the roots and pull up some of those nodules to get some source of nitrogen to add to as an amendment. That process does require quite a bit of cultivating, because you need to spread it out and consider. Then he talked about something of small till or no till, and that is that you don't disturb the soil at all. When you think about it, when you walk in the woods, nobody's tilling in there, and that stuff seems to grow just fine. So he has been practicing the small till, no till method. And he says, as long as you stir the soil, the less you stir it, the better, as long as you keep the weeds down. So you could do that with some mulch or whatever to help keep the weeds down, or just be persistent and take the weeds out all along. By the way, he said that he hadn't run any power equipment for quite a number of years on his garden. He also said that the commercial farming industry has done a lot of research through universities with a method of that called shallow cultivation, where farmers would only disturb the first 2 or 3 inches, and then only once in a while go deep. That the depth of how deep you go would depend on what kind of plant, because you need to accommodate enough depth so that the plant can flourish. For instance, a potato takes more depth, and a tree might even need more, whereas some little things like a radish may not need very much, or lettuce. Dr. Amy mentioned that he had not had any mechanized equipment in his garden in 15 years. So he's basically practicing this method and has not had a problem as long as he keep at it with the weeds. So the other thing he mentioned is you can use ashes out of your stove, and that will add all kinds of positive things to your garden makeup. He said the ratio that he recommends is a bucket full of ashes for the whole garden. He says if you do too much, it'll run things out of balance. So you take that bucket and you spread it like what he described as light snowstorm, similar to what we're seeing in the picture. But you don't want to do too much, because it's very concentrated chemically and it could get things out of balance. A little bit is very good. The third and final gardening expert that we're going to tap into is De Torre. He's an experienced gardener. He makes custom amendments for people that he sells, and he's quite good at pruning fruit trees. He recommends that your normal amendments, such as 10-20-20 or 18-18-18 or 16-16-16, they're different combinations of 3 primary elements. And if you use amendments like you would buy from the store, you want to be careful that if you're in a rainy region, it gets deficient, because the soil gets leached out, and you'll get low on boron, magnesium, sulfur, calcium, potassium, and phosphorus. So if you're in an area where your garden gets rained on a lot, you need to compensate for that. Now, about making your own amendments. He has some interesting and very unusual recommendations. First of all, you always would take your table scraps, and he's suggesting, again, this is when you couldn't buy or sell and you're quite desperate, you would use human waste, particularly if you didn't have chickens and a cow and a horse. So while normally human waste is not used in a garden and is kind of disgusting to think about it, his method, he suggests, is a way to make it useful. And the process is you take a 5-gallon bucket, you have 5-gallon buckets, and you start filling one at a time. And you put the table scraps and the retrieved human waste, not the urine. When the 4th bucket gets full, then you bury in the second garden for the next year. So you have a section that is not being used, just like we showed in Lloyd Amy's illustration, and you would have a place where you would bury these scraps and let them decompose. So you would be not using it that year, but you'd be using it for the next year. And he cautioned, if you're going to use human waste, only do it if you're eating healthy. No medications, preferably a vegan. And so So what do you do with this combination in this second garden, in this unused garden that's waiting for the next year? He recommends digging a trench 14 to 18 inches deep, and then put a layer of fireplace ash out of your stove. He he deviates from Dr. Amy's recommendation and suggests putting a heavier dusting. If you're using horse manure, then you need to make sure that your horse is not being fed antibiotics. And while the horse manure is piled up, that there isn't fly larva killer on the dung piles. So if you're getting horse manure from a neighbor or some nearby person, you need to investigate what, if anything, is fed to the horse in terms of antibiotics, and if the pile of manure that's sitting there has fly larva killer. And the reason farmers will do that is to get rid of the flies, because it's killing the flies before they're born. So that isn't a good thing to have in your garden, according to Delatory. On top of the compost of the grass, you put grass clippings on top of the compost, and it can be dead leaves or any organic matter. So it will decompose, and that's a layer. So you've got the compost on the bottom. You then have any manure if you have it, and then and then ashes, and then horse manure, and then you put the top of the compost is grass clippings or dead leaves or any organic matter. Now, he said that putting ashes on is really a good thing because it adds calcium, phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients like zinc, sulfur, iron, copper, manganese, and magnesium. The ratios can vary according to the soils where the trees come from. So if you are burning maple trees primarily, then that would be a particular ratio as compared to, say, alder trees. So a little bit of research would be good to figure out the ratio that is appropriate for the kind of wood that you're burning. Just not wood in general, but find out what kind of trees they are. And this strategy is the same with horse waste. So you want to learn what the horse is eating, because that will have some indication of the kind of ratio you want to consider according to what the horse has been eating. So now you've taken these 5 buckets and you've put them in the trench, and you've added these layers of, grass clippings and ashes and so forth. And he says, don't just wash out the buckets. He says, rinse the buckets one into the other so you're saving the water. And then pour all the rinse water onto the compost. That way you're not losing some of those nutrients that would get thrown out. Now, by then, your trench should be up to 8 inches from the top of the ground, and so the rest of that is going to be your native topsoil going back into the trench. Now, he also talked about cover crops. Delatory recommended buckwheat. Buckwheat is one where you can save the seed, and it's nutritious and pretty productive. So he suggested considering buckwheat as a cover crop. You'll remember Lloyd Amy's experience was peas and legumes. So here's another option, buckwheat. And probably you're not going to be able to grow wheat per se because of your gardening situation. So buckwheat might be a good alternative. So according to Delatory, now is the time to start collecting seeds. And we're going to talk in the next unit about open-pollinated or heirloom and heritage seeds, and how to save seeds and what kind you can save, so that when you are not able to buy and sell, you can gather seeds from the season and use them for the next year. And this is explained in the Bible as well of how to do that. So we want to look forward to next time when we talk about seeds.